Hi guys, I'm Anguel, and this is my show and tell for Potionomics. So about us, I'm responsible for characters, animation. I listed myself as Pipeline Overlord because I like making up funny titles. But basically my job was to hire Emily, the person below me in the picture, to do my work for me for the most part. And I mean, you know how it goes, right? Management. It's a good role. No, but so Emily is responsible for animation, but also a certain amount of concept art. I just want to recognize that because she's a great illustrator. About Voracious Games, the way Jadi approached me when I was at GDC about, I guess, 7 years ago now, in that picture, was he mentioned that it was either starting a video game company or he was going to go play Pro Street Fighter. And I liked that setup. I really liked that background for the founding of the company and the starting of our first project. Anyway, so the game itself, Potionomics, right, the titular thing we're here to talk about, was inspired by Reciteer, Little Witch Academia, and a hunch that character matters. That's nice to hear, right? So by the end of it, we ended up with like about 3,000 animations, give or take. I can't guarantee that every single one of that last 247 is actually being used, because there's always some spillover, but we got through quite a bit, and we got an Annie nomination, so Yay, nice and concise. There we go. OK, so the first thing that comes up is that we really care about philosophy, I guess, which doesn't necessarily mean reading philosophers and stuff, but more so it means having guiding principles and concepts that let everybody have a common understanding of what the gut check is. So it's really, really important that rather than telling you that you need to make a straight line, you have a tool to make straight lines, and you understand which ones are supposed to be straight or otherwise, right? Like in the case of straights and curves, for example. So the rules and guidelines aren't a structure, but they tell you what the structure is supposed to look like, right? They're a schema in your head for imagining what's gonna be that currently isn't. Sorry if this is weirdly abstract, but I do like to talk like this, and this is part of how we communicate in the context of our meetings in terms of trying to, if it feels like things are running away, reestablish what it is that we're actually talking about in a very, very simple way. And I'll get back to why this matters in crits later. But so the title itself, Show and Tell, is because I liked show and tells as a kid, but also because showing versus telling is a fundamental adage and kind of principle and guiding philosophy of animation. And it's one that we thought about quite a bit at the start. And in school, we were taught a version of it, which was what verbs do you give the player, right? So it's you let them show the actions and the events in the game using the verbiage that you provide to them in the form of gameplay mechanics. So, every good thesis is worth subverting and flipping around and questioning and saying, well, do we have to show versus tell? Or what if telling is showing? What if the thing we're trying to do is show just emotion and conversation and some kind of back and forth dialogue that feels not like they're just talking, but that they're having some sort of authentic emotional exchange. So yeah, if the characters manage to talk about their feelings, maybe we get to show the telling and kind of shortcut some things, because all of this is leading towards the economics in Potionomics, right? I mean, the economics of the animation, which is that we kind of chopped off a lot of it. And yeah, so let's see. The other thing I wanted to hit before I go on to the next slide was the qualitative versus like quantitative differences. Again, this is just about when you discuss something, it gets really hard to talk about these abstract ideas, so you always want to have some way to thread them to specific parameters that are on screen, right? Like you're making a kind of abstract assertion that you think moving a parameter on a character's rig one way or the other actually means something regarding their emotion. And I'll have some examples in a later slide about exactly what that looks like, but I just wanted to put that conceptually out there. So the other kind of starting ideas we had, or that I had when we, kind of initiated the project, was that doing all of these animations is going to be pretty hard. Maybe we can trade the footage length of animation for packing in more character. Maybe if we don't have to do, like, let's say, the anticipation, then we have more time for the follow-through and the settling, right? In the most simple terms. And moving beyond that, I think it's worth thinking about principles as things that you can exchange. You don't have to adhere to them, because if you really want to be creative, you have to be willing to both see and acknowledge and utilize those principles when they're useful in pursuing your kind of on-screen goal, as well as abandoning them the second that they provide too much friction and start to get in the way. It's important to be sensitive to that, and that's where the abstract understanding comes into play, because that abstract understanding is what lets you understand whether it's going in the direction that you're actually trying to proceed. Yeah, and then another really important idea was this whole thing about that the game is in the player's head, right? No matter what we're showing on screen or computing behind the computer screen, the game itself is a sort of mirage-like experience, right? Because even if in the moment you're very tied to the things that are happening, the inputs and the outputs, and all of the mechanical interactions, a large part of the experience of the game is just your memory of what you took away from it, right? So in reality, most of it, especially over time, as you get further and further away from the experience in question, right, that point in time when you played the game, most of your experience with the game is just some kind of memory reconstruction based on a few lingering data points of what you think you experienced when you were actually playing the game. And that's really important when you're trying to be creative and come up with wacky new poses, because eventually you start running out of ideas. It gets tough. So before we get towards animation principles themselves, I just want to cover that I think also another really important thing for appeal and appealing animation is the models, and being willing to spend an inordinate amount of time scrutinizing things. And from I guess an intersectional perspective of disciplines, I spend a lot of time drawing. I've done all my anatomy studies. And I'm not sure there's really a way to skip past that stuff, unfortunately. I wish there was a bit of a shortcut, but nah, it's probably a good solid 5 years of regular life drawing, in my opinion anyway. I really do think it makes a massive difference, because the easiest way for me to encompass it is the idea of draft in sculpture, right? So draft is about the depth and the volume that you manage to represent, and it's one of those things that when you know how to recognize it, it's easy to spot. But when it's missing, it can be hard to identify that that's exactly what's missing or what the delta is there. But draft in particular, and having good volumes, affects a lot about your ability to move the controllers and everything that's deforming the mesh along curves and arcs, right? So it's if you want the animation to be on arcs, but the components within your rig are moving linearly, you're kind of always going to be fighting some sort of janky on-screen paths when you think about what the viewer is seeing inside of the 2D template, right? Because ultimately, unless you're doing VR stuff, I'm not talking to you guys. We're talking about a flat-ass canvas, right? At some point, it comes back to this little rectangle, and there's some kind of relationship between any element on screen and the edges. And so that means it's all contained in that canvas. And so, yeah, keeping it on arcs and doing all that nice, appealing stuff, getting the fluidity is extra difficult when you haven't exercised the discipline to make sure that it adheres to those things in its own structure. One more thing I'll say about it. I didn't mean to dwell on this one for so long, but also it's important to remember that like the state that especially any organic thing that you're modeling is the outcome of a bunch of like processes, right? Like no thing is actually static, and so like the volume of your jaw is something that has been pushed into that volume by various forces, right? By the forces of like your bone growth that grows according to a certain logic. And it doesn't matter what the details and the sciencey bits of that logic are. The more important thing is that you can identify that it's different for one segment versus the other, so that when you're representing anatomical features, you understand how to resolve them as they start pushing against each other. Because that's where a lot of these things I find fall apart when people try to make models that are appealing but also flexible. It's very easy to want to cheat things to the way the sculpt is being presented, but then as soon as you start moving it, it becomes an absolute nightmare. And that's why in our sculpting guidelines, the whole bottom section is just retopology guidelines, stuff about like where polygons go and how they should look, and this, all of these rules basically have a fall off from the characters' heads and hands, which are the highest resolution in all respects. We pay the most attention to them in animation. They have the most joints in basically all the characters. They get the most polygon detail, and then it radiates outward towards the other things we don't include on screen very much, and that we don't really utilize to emote, right? Because the primary emotion is always coming through the relationship between the head, face, and hands, and whatever they're trying to signal using those. Actually, I pretty much already covered this part regarding articulation and the thing. I forgot I forgot that was on this slide. Yeah, basically, good rigging interfaces allow you to maintain those curves and arcs that you're trying to make. I'm a huge proponent of trying to make everything move in FK manners, right? I mean, that's like a common thing, but I'm just like a massive stickler, and I really believe that like nobody is enough of a stickler on this, because you can always spot where animators are trying to cheat and use linear interpolation when they shouldn't. So now finally getting to the animation principles themselves, right? We have like the classical principles on the left, and then the ones we were left with on the right. We basically crossed off everything on the list because it was too much to deal with. The big conceit was, actually it's funny to me, like looking back at these, seeing what how the original principles prioritized things, right? Putting squash and stretch at the top shows me that one of their main concerns was the physicality and the physical plausibility, which I guess when you're trying to discover animation for the first time, that's probably one of the biggest challenges on your mind. But for us, we kind of started from the bottom with appeal and felt like maybe that one should be up at the top or close to it. And in our version of the principles, we write both character and appeal because, again, they have this is part of that territory of like conceptual abstract differences. Which one is the most important can vary at any given time. Whether we go with prioritizing just something that looks appealing in a sort of abstract sense of appealing shapes, or we don't do that and sacrifice the appeal a little bit to maintain character, usually has to do with the gameplay priorities, right? Of what exactly we're trying to give as feedback to the player, because every one of these emotes is attached to some card or action or game state for the character. And so ultimately the success in communicating the emotional label that we never actually put on screen, right? Like we don't say that the character's sad, they just say something and they look sad. So there's this like conceptual gap that you're trying to get the player to understand and bridge. And yeah, you basically do that by negotiating all of these principles. And for us, it's character, pose, and appeal are like the holy trinity, right? Pose is our main tool. Everything I try to break down into pose. I'm like a big believer in pose-to-pose animation. I don't know what they were talking about with straight aheads. I'm not about that stuff. Lay the poses down. We went so far as to basically block out the entire game in pose, right? Like every single animation existed as a single static frame initially, and it was expected to communicate that state and that action without any motion, right? Static should be good enough. If it didn't pass that bar, it probably just wasn't that good of a pose. And actually, that's gonna get into the trademark poses, right? If it's that good of a pose, you should feel comfortable enough putting like a brand on it and saying, oh, TM, that is that character, right? This is unique to that character. No one else is really gonna approach that kind of posture, that orientation. Luna's a really fun one because like with the 4 arms, you can do all sorts of creative, unusual combinations with what she is occupying herself with, right? It's always fun to give characters business, but Luna gets to exercise maximum business, which also fits with her character. Then Quinn's TM pose, that was one we hit pretty early on, just that sense of defeat and disinterest, I guess. Whereas then Anubia is a character who is cute and she knows it and she exploits it. And Baptiste is just always feeling himself. Good for him. Yeah, so arcs, I want to shout out arcs. They're the greatest of the original principles, aside from character and appeal. I think arcs are like, it's one of those things where people talk about it incessantly, but I feel like somehow we still don't talk about it enough, or we haven't come to like a good, concise way to communicate the concept. Because so here in this example, you can see some of my shitty notes that I drew over one of Mint's animations. And I put these on screen this way because I wanted to make it clear that, like, you know, all of that drawing skill doesn't go into good drawings on top of these things. It goes more into good selections of these abstract shapes, right? Like if you look at that green shape that's formed on the middle mint, right? That sort of inward squishy shape is something that appears anywhere something is extending. So in terms of like squash and stretch, to come back to that principle, I think a lot of the times those, I guess maybe one of my issues with like the baseline principles and thinking in terms of like the 12 classical principles, obviously nobody's super dogmatic about adhering to them, but it's easy to get into that mindset and start adhering to something just because it was said, right? That idea gets into your head and you start thinking about your conventional understanding of it versus a subtler, more abstract understanding of it. So in this case, right, that stretching shape indicates that Mint, as she's stretching outward, should bring her hands inward because that creates an FK motion inside of the rest of the motion, right? The FK motion around her elbows versus just trying to stick her hands out using the IK interpolation that you're not supposed to use. You're not allowed. I'm not going to let you. And another little note in terms of posing is, so one of the principles we struck off was overlap and follow through. But to some extent, again, we can cheat overlap back into the poses by spending so much time on these key poses. I drew a little indication there of the shape of the hands to have the fingers kind of drag behind. So if you're thinking about how you can like cheat one principle into another, I think that's often like a good place to start coming up with new ideas or at least options in terms of how to address something in an economical and limited fashion, right? If you think about like South Park, for example, that was weird. If you think about South Park, for example, they're not doing a whole lot with those characters, right? It's just about the kind of like energy, the amplitude, and yeah, that's pretty much it. They just use like timing and and I don't know what else. I guess things move on arcs because they have to. So another principle that we came upon was kind of coming back around to solid drawing. So this is one that I think gets sacrificed like a lot in video games. And it's often a topic, something that we struggle with, or we put a bunch of work in some little feature to massage a tiny little transition between some states that are otherwise difficult to resolve. But yeah, it is a real thorn in the ass, that one. And I think my favorite example is just ragdolls. That's why I put this. I think it's from a mod, actually, but just this GTA screenshot, because I've always found them hilariously uncanny, but also really inspiring, because if players can accept that kind of jank, then probably they can accept us not having the first half of the animation on every single animation in the game. And so in terms of like the solid drawing concept, the other thing I want to emphasize, because we also wrote every frame of painting, we liked to talk about things that way. We'd like to talk about maintaining the appeal and the solidity of the drawing of the character on all frames. I think, especially in game animation, sometimes there's such an emphasis on the physicality of things, because that's usually most of what's giving feedback about gameplay parameters, that people tend to get really carried away, I think, with breaking rigs down, right? With this sort of belief, actually, previous speaker mentioned it, that small jitters in motion won't be detected, but I think they really will be. I do think they do something in regard to how people read it in their minds, and again, how they basically save the memory of what they think that they saw. Right? Because we're always playing with illusions to some extent. And that's also one of the reasons that animations kind of start in the middle of the action in Potionomics, is because, well, if they didn't quite catch the beginning, maybe they'll fill in a little extra for us, And it turns out they do. So coming back around to animation principles in Crit, this is also another place I would say that any kind of background in drawing or general art is super, super useful, because it can be difficult to get good feedback and input on things if you're mired in technical language and jargon that isn't easily recognizable or easily explainable to somebody who's less experienced in the profession, but they can have a lot of very useful insights and observations on how people express themselves. And if you're trying to replicate character, that's really the most important part, rather than the jargony bits of all the principles that you're dealing with. And so, in that interest, as much as I talk, we tried to kind of minimize the active vocabulary of what parameters we're talking about. And actually, I don't like that Twitter one is there. I'm going to get back to that one. Okay, so in terms of feedback and acting and ideas and emotion, acting it out should be compulsory. Okay, thanks, man. Acting it out really should be compulsory. I think every animator should just be sent to the gulags if they don't have time to live life and explore things, explore some kind of expressive type of movement, dancing, athletics. I'm not joking here. I really think it makes it's an instrumental difference, right? When Emily started working on the project, she started snowboarding, for example, and all of these little things give you new opportunities to recognize interactions between people and context within which they interact and emote. So let's get to that kind of stuff. The illusion of consciousness. The illusion of life is the original one, but to me, the kind of more important thing isn't just life, because that's like the first bar, right? Is that something is alive, breathing, but when it's conscious, then you want to know what's on its mind, right? What is it thinking? And that's when it's able to have emotions. And I used the picture from RoboCop of Kane's brain there with the googly eyes, because that's kind of how I imagine this stuff on the most base level. And I also find things like these heat maps kind of useful to think about in terms of where does the feeling reside within the character? However, all of these sciencey little factoids are great and useful, but it's important to remember things like, for example, anger and happiness and love and pride. If we look at them all from the chest up here, they look identical, right? So again, you don't want to get too stuck on any of these kinds of rules that you create or find for yourself, especially anatomical references, scientific references can be very slippery slopes, especially if you think that you understand the material in question, and then you start applying it very rigorously and find yourself down some weird, wacky, uncanny path way after you can change course. So here's a few of the initial explorations of Sylvia, kind of trying to search for her TM attitude. I'd say the top middle one is around when we hit it. We also did get one contract animation from a friend of mine that was very informative, but lost somewhere in the history of our files, unfortunately. And so these are the first, some of the first successful anims that got splined out of the poses, right? These are some like really core explorations we did, because at this point we got to start thinking about not just the body language of Sylvia or of one of the other characters, but what is Sylvia's body language like when she is trying to represent the body language of another character, right? Which things does she observe and retain and reflect from whatever she learned from the other character? Because the kind of fundamental progression mechanic in the card games is that you pick up different kinds of arguments you can use in haggling from these other characters you interact with. And part of that involves understanding something about their emotional journey and them as a person. And that's kind of what enables Sylvia to imbibe that knowledge. Oh man, I gotta stop breathing on this. Yeah, okay, so now we can touch on the body language parameters really quickly. How many minutes do I have left? I think I'm like right at the end, right? Okay, awesome. Let's just blast through it. Okay, body language parameters. For me, the most important thing is to remember that everything is pointing at something at all times, right? Especially the face and hands, right? These are your big communication tools. They're very articulate. They've got a lot of little features. And we as human beings are very sensitive to all the little nuances and changes in the shapes, right? So then moving beyond that and kind of reconnect into the idea of the central nervous system, the other thing I like to think about is basically what kind of torsion the spine is going through and where that puts the head, chest, and hips in terms of what they're pointing at, because it gives a lot of kind of contextual clues for characters that you can utilize to think about subtext in their body language, right? So for example, some characters are going to be maybe more prone to covering their stomach, right? Or covering their chest. Or how is it that they, if you think about the heat maps, what is their reaction to where the energy or heat is sitting in their body during that emotion? Just because they're feeling the same kind of like temperature fluctuation in their body doesn't necessarily mean that they physically react to it the same way, right? Some of them may react to it directly. Some of them may want to not indicate that they're feeling that. And that basically comes from where things are pointing at, right? We kind of tend to think in terms of, is it pointing at the other character or away from the other character? And if it's pointing away from the other character, what is it pointing at? Is it pointing at something here? Is it pointing at something there? Is it pointing at something in the past? Are they thinking about something in the future? Or are they imagining something? And further, you can consider, you know, does the character in question look up or down when they imagine something, right? What is their emotional connection to the thing that they're imagining in their mind? And that's, you know, that's what I was referring to earlier in terms of like having kind of simplified geometric parameters. Because when you make the conversation less about like the timing of something and more about, okay, does this character want to wave directly at Sylvia, or are they like more casual about how they wave at Sylvia, right? Does that make sense? Yeah? Because then you can think about the actual, like, it's just a change of angle, right? That's all we're talking about at this point. But we're able to kind of tie it more directly to the kind of emotional connection or lack thereof, and again, the subtext layers of which emotions we're talking about with any given component of the body. Eye lines also, lines, arrows. Like I said, everything is pointing at something. I really enjoy these expressions from Boston. But yeah, I pretty much already explained this one. No rake hands, please. Oh, God, for God's sake, don't ever, ever just grab all the controllers and rotate them together. The human hand doesn't function that way. I would recommend Bridgman. I'm a big fan of his. I think one of the most important things is to understand how to simplify hand movements and to think of them in fewer surfaces than you actually have, right? Because there's a lot of little bits to hands and fingers. They can be hard to manage, I understand, but simple geometry can get you through it. It can help you. Let's see, final ones. Okay, so one other thing I wanted to point out about silhouette, it's like a pet peeve of mine. People like to talk about silhouette. We're over? Okay. People like to talk about silhouette, but they don't think about internal silhouettes. So in this case, we have Baptiste holding a mic there in the middle. And the initial thought is to maybe bump his elbow out so that you can see it in the literal sense of the silhouette edge of himself. But if you really understand that the context of this is for him to show the mic and make the mic clear, then the more important thing is the angle and placement of the microphone rather than where his elbow is, right? And that isn't really breaking out of his physical silhouette, but really it gets its own silhouette by virtue of color contrast just within the space of his chest. Right? So it's important to think about it in a graphic nature. And that's it.